Hi, and welcome back to the Mod Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we have Artie Gold to talk about scope and cognitive load, clarity of value on stories. Code is everything, code is nothing. But Artie, maybe first you can kind of give an introduction and talk a little bit about what made you interested in all this.
Sure. I've been a developer for a very long time. Sometimes it seems like a longer time than it should have been, but that's okay. Um, and one of the things that's been interesting is keeping up with uh the kinds of thoughts that people throw around in terms of how we should do this stuff. And I found it really interesting that for a long time, people try to make it complicated. And you try to make it complicated, and it kind of doesn't work. People become sort of, self-impressed with how much they know or how much they can verbalize, or how much consideration they can give to the way we do this. And it's not that complicated. Or if you try to keep it not that complicated, um, things can be easier and you can do better stuff.
All right. Well,
I'm done now. I can leave.
yeah. Well said. That's the end of the episode. No, just kidding.
Thank you so much.
I guess that brings us right into scope and cognitive load. Um, Complicated things have a heavy cognitive load, I think, and often a large scope. So,
Well,
is yeah, go ahead.
here are a couple of things just sort of real quickly is that if being able to know everything is a wonderful thing. Having to know everything at once is a terrible thing because there's a lot of it. I mean, there was a talk that I was trying to write a while back and started messing with it, and the title came up, and it was acrobats and jugglers, because very often in terms of the number of tools we use, which we usually, and that list usually gets very long without us noticing, um, we spend more time and more effort sort of serving the tools and the tools serve us. And that can be a real problem. And it becomes just sort of part of the normal day to day of how we do our work. So what happens is that, so many of our own personal cycles end up being devoted to that. It almost becomes more important than solving the problems. And that's that becomes a real drain on the efforts we put in. When it comes to scope, it becomes that question of, just as in a global sense, you have to worry about lots and lots of tools. When you're writing code, if your scope is small, and you keep your code, your scope small, and you practice the kind of encapsulation that people talk about in terms of, of classes and objects, whatever, actual paradigm you're working in. You don't want to have to know too much at once because it's hard to do. There's the old saw about as humans we can keep 5 to 7 things on top of mind at once. And for some of us, maybe it's, some of us are very good at this and can do 9 or 12, and I can usually probably do 2 or 3. And it becomes contrary to a lot of the things that we talk about in terms of the code we write. What's one of the things you'll always hear is like, have good variable names. Naming is important. Well, naming could be important, but if something only lives for about 3 lines, you know what it is. If your loop index is called I, and it's just a loop index, I isn't bad. It takes less to type. You can recognize it. It sits there all by itself, as opposed to saying things like, oh, yes, the loop index that I am using in this loop. Very descriptive. Not great to look at. So I mean that's part of it. But when it comes to scope, by keeping, pieces of whatever code we're writing small. Um, it becomes a whole lot easier to understand, becomes easier to scan. It becomes easier to, and we can get to this later, change, because the only code you never have to worry about, reading is code you never have to change. And the only code you never have to change is the stuff that you have discarded. It's just the way these things work. Um, so, and the term agile has begun to mean so many things over the course of time that I almost hate to use the word. I like agility. I like nimble. I like shallow on a lot of occasions, where you can see what the meaning is, and be able to change things. But these are the kind of things that can be so valuable in terms of providing the solutions that we try to provide.
Nice, nice. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it resonated a lot with what you said, and maybe we can go dark before we go to the light, so to speak. And what, in your experiences, what have you seen in development environments, either for you personally or in others, where you turn up the scope really high and the cognitive load really high? What's that development experience been like for you?
You know, consider one of the things that often happens in a lot of development environments, especially when I mean, between books about coding or introductory exercises, um, or even when you're starting to deal with a certain a certain bit of subject matter in terms of writing code for it. People write scripts, people write um, um, essentially narrative descriptions of what they're doing. So you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this. And then as you become more knowledgeable about the subject matter, there are four other things that go on. It ends up being this long story. And the problem with that is that suddenly you're looking at, a 200 line function. And, somebody who understands the narrative and understands the way the story goes, can do fine with it. But if you weren't there at the creation, you look at it and go, wait, what? What's going on here? I don't know what this is anymore, because you don't have the when you no longer have the connection to the original problem. You don't have the ability to chunk in your mind in terms of what the various pieces are. So that's exactly where you want to break things down. Um, and especially if you're ever going to work on this code again, at some point you have to make that change. Very often what happens is that somebody writes a script, and it gets enhanced, and it gets bigger, and it gets enhanced, and it gets bigger, because nobody wants to break it up into things. But first of all, pretty soon you have no way of being able to tell if it's right. You have no way to be, even if you have tests around it, there's so much stuff going on that if a test fails, well, you're going to be sitting there for, hours of debugging, trying to figure out what's going on. Break it down. It's easy, it's cheap. And very often what happens is that, you solve a problem, and you get this, this 40 line chunk of code to work. And you write a test against it, and it works, and you feel really good about it. And at that moment, you know it really, really well. So what do? You sit there and you go, I've been working on this for 2 hours. I want to get this done. You commit it, you push it, you're done. And somebody looks at, it in 6 months, maybe you, and you have to change things. They're going, what was I thinking? I don't
Yeah.
remember what I was thinking. I don't remember what I was thinking yesterday. How am I supposed to remember what I was thinking 6 months ago? That was somebody else. So that's That's one of the things that happens. And I think also because of the fact that, as developers, we're sort of this self-selected group, and, we believe that we can remember 12 things at a time. Um, and we show that, we can climb up those 300 steps. We can do that every day, but it's not really efficient. It's not efficient in terms of being able to produce value from a certain level of effort. And that's producing value ends up being the whole point. I mean, very often in, different organizations, that's not the case, but you got to be looking at the idea of trying to do the right thing, or, you kind of go crazy a little bit, as I can evidence, but that's, a whole nother thing.
Right.
Nice.
Well, I think breaking these things up. So I find often people used to writing code that way, very, very large and verbose, and often knowing the whole context and then coming back. Uh, it is. I often hear kind of the argument of, well, it's easier to read this way because you can read it top to bottom, rather than extracting it in chunks of code and going in and out of the context. And so, what do you say to the people that are kind of um, so ingrained in working that way that they are?
Absolutely. And there's a point to, the story. And the thing I always say at that point is, imagine you're visiting my house, and you want to get a gallon of milk, and I describe to you, um, you know, how to, you can go to a store and, you know, get a gallon of milk, and let me explain how to do this. First push off on your right leg, and you will land your left leg, steady yourself. Now push off on your left leg, and, you know, then land with your right leg, and continue this until you get to the vehicle that's out front. Okay. Now, reach into your pocket and grab this key,
Right.
and turn it, and you're get, and of course, okay, maybe it's not at that level. So it's like, oh, okay. Um, drive the car down the block. Okay, so we've chunked already. We've
Right.
already, turned things into methods. And there's a stop sign at the corner, so stop at that stop sign. Make sure there's nothing that, there's no traffic. Then continue on until you get to the next stop sign. And you can always, introduce different levels
Right.
of that, but it's exhausting. And there are a lot of things, once you've done it, you don't need to know it anymore. But sometimes you're not sure. Another thing about, more directly to scope, if you set a variable, and you set a variable on line 3 of the function, one of the things that always comes to my mind is that, okay, you've set this variable. At which point do I no longer care about that?
Mhm.
At which point can I throw that out of my mind
Yep.
and leave room for other stuff? Do I
Yep.
need to notice this? And it's that whole effect. And one of the things that I also find is that when you're conscious of that, especially at that moment where things are working, you know how things work, and you don't toss out everything, and that's the moment where you know it. And that's the moment where you start tossing things out you don't need. You start tossing, you start breaking scope down, and the solution becomes simpler. And very often you notice things like, oh yeah, I guess I didn't have to do it that way. Okay. I'm doing this, I'm using a loop index. I never used a loop index. Oh, gee. So I can use a different construct. I can use a different idiom, to do what I'm doing. And it becomes yet simpler. And if you do that, the next course, Slavo has to look at the code again, maybe me, probably me. Will have a much better time, and you're able to generate you're able to generate value because,
Yeah.
again, that's the point. We solve things. Talking about from a macro standpoint, when you're dealing with lots and lots of tools, if you can hide that in some way, if you can chunk that in some way, if you can essentially not have to worry about the idea that, oh yeah, okay, I'm using Redis here, but that's wrapped up in something where you're just making a call and there may be something else going on behind the curtain, but you don't have to think about it. You win.
Yeah.
And that's, and at each level, that becomes the nature of what we do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I have a follow-up kind of human / coaching question on this, because it's something that's I've encountered recently and I've encountered many times in the past. And this whole chunking and scoping small is something that I've personally wholeheartedly embraced, and it's extremely peaceful, right? Like I come into a function and let's say it's well written. I don't need to know all the nitty-gritty details. Like you said, like lift your right leg and then move your left leg. I can read like drive to the store and I'm fine just reading that instruction and going to the next line that says go into the store and buy the milk. You know what I mean? And then I read like the 2 or 3 methods after that. And then I'm happy reading that level and only going into the method, going to the store and buy the milk if I need to know the detail. However, while mob programming, I've come across it several times where people get frustrated with code like this, where things are chunked up into pieces, because of the way the term I've been throwing around lately is paradigms of code reading, where when they see those, like say 3 high-level methods, what they do when they read it, like they don't do what I do when I read it, which is I just keep only a few things in my mind at once, right? Like 2 or 3 at most, is they try to keep that whole context in their head, go into that method, read all the low-level details, pop back out of that method, come back to the top level, try to keep those 20 things in their head, go to the next method, pop into that. So basically, as they're reading it, they try to expand it into the long method again. And so far in my coaching, I'm basically just saying, don't do that, but I don't know if that's good advice.
I guess what's interesting about it is that it, just like anything else, it's the kind of thing where you need to train yourself a little bit, where it's like, okay, if you assume that, this is one of the places where naming becomes really important, where developing developing a language of naming becomes really important. Because, you've got to be able to, you've got to do 2 things. You've got to be able to communicate the semantics as well as communicate and get across the idea of trust. If I tell you that, I'm going to go get this thing and I'm going to hand it to you, you may be interested in how I go get that thing, and that's fine. But you don't have to know that in order to understand the process of what's being described. It can become a separate thing. It's like, okay, you hand me this ID, and I'm going to give you these bits of information. And the fact that it's in a database, and the fact that it's in Mongo or PostgreSDB or Redis or CouchDB or DMS2, as I'm showing my vintage, doesn't matter. Or as I love to say, or that information is really coming from some guy in a wire room, in the caverns below Kansas City. I don't know. It doesn't matter. You don't care. So it's a way of looking at it. It's a way of saying, I don't need to know this all at once. It's in a way, it's the stack machine. I've got this and this, and that's on the stack, and I will worry about that later.
Okay.
And then it comes out. Now I use it.
Yeah. Gotcha. Cool, cool, cool.
But the other thing is that, when you're talking about, from mobbing or coaching, kind of situation. One of the things that I do find interesting with, the mobbing I've done is that there's a certain amount of time, while you're working, that you're active. I mean, you're either at the keyboard, or you're navigating, and you're active, and you're sort of front loaded, as it were. Um, and you're using your conscious mind to figure out what to do next. You're doing the thing, and between those times, you're able to see how this stuff works. You're able to, let the subconscious mind, which is really, really good at things, working in not quite real time, of finding the patterns, finding the underlying language uh, uh, of how the entities within, whatever problem you're solving work. You're able to use those, those abilities we have that we don't directly think about. We don't format our speech as if we have a grammar book and a dictionary. We're doing this at a different level, and that's valuable. I mean, that's the whole idea of, if you're there at the creation, you understand things better. Why? Because your subconscious mind has been able to take in that information. It's not, it's not just the equational reasoning in front of you. It's how you got there. It's the language part, and that's
Well,
something that's valuable. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
No,
Finish.
I'm done.
Okay. Well, it might be a good time to pivot to the clarity of value on stories.
Sure.
And uh, maybe it ties in a bit into what we were talking about, but maybe what were you thinking with that?
On that, a lot of times what unfortunately happens in organizations is that, there's always that idea of, there's a customer, and the customer says, well, I want this because I need that. Well, if you have that direct relationship with a customer, and the customer is sitting at the table, whether it's, real or virtual, or that part doesn't matter. And you're in a position where you can go, well, how about this? Let me show you this. Does this help you get to where you want? Well, that's a nice thing. That's a great thing. It's also something that we don't always get to see because we're not working in that environment. So instead, what often happens, and if you work in in a large environment, well, what's happened is that you're getting the request from somebody who got the request from somebody who got the request from someone else. And it's like, well, and as a developer, you want to ask, what's the value? What does this do for somebody? Well, we want this number. Why? And the reason you ask why is not because you want to be, a pain, even though I usually am. You want to know things like, how accurate does the number need to be? Does it really matter? Sometimes close is good. How fast do you want the number? Do you want it live? Do you want this to be something that's pretty fresh and pre-calculated? What's more important to you, accuracy or speed? And I'm not saying to be inaccurate. You're going to be close. So, and so this is one of the reasons why, value needs to be communicated when people write tickets, when people write requests. What is the purpose of this? And you don't have, and inevitably what happens when you start discussing things like this is that somebody goes, yes, you're right. We need to have a template. We need to make sure that everybody, answers these 12 questions. No, that's not useful on a lot of occasions, because you end up with, okay, What is the user? So being able to communicate that and being able to have cogent understanding of what a project, I shouldn't say project, what a product is supposed to do, and what kind of feature that that a user wants, or a piece of information that a user wants, or a something that a user wants to have access to, um, and being able to understand what the value is. And one of the reasons why is that um, users, customers, whatever you want to call them, um, do they know what, it's not that they don't know what they want, it's that they don't fully know how to express what they want because they haven't seen it yet. It's a whole lot easier to say, oh, okay, you've handed me this thing. Well, this almost does what I want, but we want to change this a little bit. And that's where some of the value is. We can show you something, and then you can tell, for example, what color blue do you want? Um, I don't know. Are there different blues? Oh, well, how about this? Well, I don't really like that one. Let's make it a little darker. Oh, so if you can change it and make it a little darker, well,
Mhm.
now you're going to get somewhere. So
Is a lot of
it's,
this eliminating like overproduction waste and like you talk about seven deadly wastes and lean and things like that. The the clarity of the value on a story, it's kind of a developer's responsibility to understand the value of what they're building, to provide feedback on what ends up being built in order to uh, help eliminate overproduction or over refinement of a story
I think that's what a lot of it is that, over refinement is deadly.
yeah,
Just because it's a lot of effort, and it's a case of, if I spend a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money, handing you a lovely polished emerald, and what you wanted was a ruby, well, you
right,
wasted a lot. Whereas if I show you a rock and you say, well, it would be nice if it were red. Okay, we just avoided a whole, bunch of problem here. We can get to what the actual, what the real value is.
right,
So, when people go, well, we need a wireframe, and we need to be very specific about it. It's like, no, you know, do a drawing on the back of a napkin and let's produce something that sort of conforms to that, and then make some comments, and then we can change things, and that's okay.
right,
um you have to get it, and it's product knowledge. It's which, very often what happens is that people are overburdened, and they end up, and you end up in a situation where there are people, on the other side of the discussion, who are pushing virtual paper.
yeah,
And it's not their fault, that's what they're presented with. They don't have the opportunity to, really have the knowledge about the product either, because nobody has really described. Very often you also have the situation where, well, what becomes, what's really important is to very well document this first. It's like, oh, big design up front, that's good. But it's even worse because, in your experience, and I don't know if I can take, can put myself on this list of people. How many people can write really well? A relatively small percentage of people can write really well. It's something I've been able to write kind of well on some occasions. You know, a lot of people write a lot of stuff because it's part of their job description. But how many write well?
yeah.
And you know, all of these things, you can't just assume that, well, it's documented, so therefore we understand it. Well, no.
Yeah. And yeah, I think you're totally right that written communication can have a lot of difficulties, even when well written, right?
Yeah,
I don't know if you've been
sure.
there before where you're like, I've even mob written something before, and we're like, we've checked it 5 different ways to be like, okay, we've clarified that it won't, be interpreted this way or that way. We've kind of added those
Yeah.
things in, and then someone still takes it a different way, you know what I mean? And that kind of thing. And so yeah, it's quite difficult. Yeah.
And written stuff, look, written stuff is important. I'm not going to say, don't document
Yeah.
everything. I'm not going to say that at all. But a lot of times the combination of the overdependence upon it and the belief that it's been written down, therefore it is truth, is just as bad as we gave you a number, and because it's a number, it's a
Yeah.
number, it's meaningful. Maybe, you know. Uh,
Yeah.
so it's and one of the things, just sort of circle back on value, and one of the things that I think we do a lot of the time is that we have this belief that if we think really hard about something, we're going to be right. And when you're working on a feature, when you're working on defining a feature, um, and if you tell yourself, if we work really hard on this, we're going to be right. Well, they work really, really hard on the Edsel. And they produced, actually a very impressive product.
Yeah.
And Ford lost a lot of money doing that. And
Mm.
the reason is that assume you're not going to be right. Assume, not that you're going to be wrong, but assume that something is going to need modification and, further work on it. And if you go all in on the first thing you think of because you're sure you're right, you're going to end up doing a lot of that waste stuff we were talking about before.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And another follow-up question I had was I really resonated with you said about I think I've seen this a number of different ways in many different organizations is a team or a person is good at a thing, and then instead of other ways of transferring that, goodness, it turns into a checklist of things this person typically does, or it turns into a template, like you said. And it's difficult, right? Because the art of conversation is hard to script up front because it's often, and this is something I've learned a lot from you, Chris, is often you'll adjust your style, tactic, questions, content, type of questions dramatically just based off of the first thing they say, right? And so questions 2 through 12 on the template might be pointless given how they respond to question 1, right? Or whatever, right? And so given that you can't just templatize something like that, how do you assume there is someone who's good at this art of story conversation on value? How do you help transfer that skill other than a parroted template or something?
you know, it's unfortunately not easy, and it's unfortunately not easy often because of the fact that the people responsible for the story creation and the narrative part is often part of a slightly different organization than the people who are going to execute. So as a result, they often have their own pressures because assumptions are being made
Mm.
from, in the line that they're in, that, well, you write it down and they do it. You know, that's the way this works, isn't it? Um, and there's a lot of discussion that I've run into recently about how much technical knowledge does somebody need to have on the product side.
Mm.
And I think that some people say, well, the best product people I've ever dealt with are former developers. And other people say, well, the best product people I've worked with are people who understand what the product is supposed to do because they have a background in, in that particular domain.
Mm.
And often it's a case of it's somewhere in between where, um, uh, the best possible, the best product folks are the ones who are the most comfortable with what they don't know and can embrace the idea of, okay, I don't know exactly how to do this, but let me explore, but this is the value that we want to get from this. This is this is what that value proposition is that we want to get across. And if somebody can do that, it's a great thing, and you're able to move forward on things.
Yeah, I think of it as maybe like untangling a fishing line or something.
Yeah,
Right. So like we have to deliver all of this as just a ball of fishing line with like a
that's
hook
right.
because you can't pull everything out. Um and and so often it's just, the questions that I end up asking very much not in the template, is to kind of deconstruct where the extra effort can go in. And a lot of times people get stuck on the like I need it all. And so often it's just questions about, well, does this really depend on that? And that does that really depend on that? It's kind of all the way through the chain until you find
Yeah.
the thing that you can get the hook unstuck.
What
So,
yeah,
yeah,
it's what gives you some value. What
right.
subset of all the things you're asking for will give you some value, will make whoever's life better or more informed or whatever the purpose is. And if every time when we're able to get to such to such places, things where a lot of times I have found that until things are well somewhat well understood, it's like imagine you go into a store and there's a price on every item in there except that the each price is in a different currency, and you don't know what you don't know the relative value of these currencies. Well, that's often what happens in terms of product discussions, in terms of here's something, and here are 10 things. Now, three of them will actually give you a whole bunch of immediate value. The other seven will be really hard to do or very expensive, won't give you a lot of value. But you don't know because you don't know what you don't know what it's like in the trench trying to make this work. Um, so being able to get stuff like that across and being able to understand and being able to develop a shared understanding is where value lies. It's in a certain sense, it's not hard. I mean, the same way that if you have if you have a team of big sluggers, don't try to steal a lot of bases. It's just not a good idea. You
There you
know,
go. Well, yeah, it might be a good time to jump before we run out of time to code is everything and code is nothing. Oh, what are your thoughts here?
oh yeah, yeah. Um, you know, like I said before, what if we had this way of just, this notation we could use to describe what it is to describe what it is we need. And it's like, well, we do. It's a programming language. It's so code is important. Code is important because it is the thing that produces the value that we're trying to contribute. It's the thing that makes it possible. It's the thing that allows somebody to to walk over to a keyboard or look at a kiosk or look at a piece of equipment, and it and that's what makes it work, and that's also what describes how that work is done. Now, if you can do that with no code, well, that's fine. That's good. But code is important from the standpoint of your needs will change over time. Um, it's the nature of things, either, especially, you either, can do more things or you can do more with it, or your needs change. And it's always a whole lot easier if you're starting from a certain place and being able to, move on a little bit than starting over, because then you've got to, rethink your whole paradigm and start from the beginning. And that's, that can be a lot of effort. You lose all the stuff you've learned. So code is everything from the standpoint of, that's your repository of knowledge. Code does many things, but it doesn't lie.
Yeah.
Codes, if the code does things, that's what it does. It's not going to make stuff up. Yeah, okay. Occasionally, you run into, situations where you get Heisenbugs and stuff, but these are rare. But to a large extent, being able to have code in good shape is important, because you're going to look at it again, and that's the that's the code is everything part. And code is also nothing, because unless it's running on something, all it does is sit there. And that's okay too, so that's the that's the where that comment comes from.
Cool. Well, maybe before we close, can you yeah, it reminds me of the Michael Feathers quote, which is like code is your house. You're gonna live in it, right? Like code is your house. You're gonna have to live in it. So it's definitely everything and it matters. Can you add a little bit more on why it's nothing as well? It's everything and nothing. Maybe before we close.
Well, I mean, it's nothing from the standpoint of, very often, there are people who will complain about the idea of, oh, those engineers just want to make the code real pretty. And it's like, no, that's not what it is. I'm not going to drive it down the street. I'm not going to wax wax the fins so they shine in the late afternoon light. If you're going to spend time getting code into good shape, it's because you want to be able to trust it. You want to be able to change it. You want to be able to read it. You want to be able to, to understand what it does, because that's telling you what it does, and that's what you're living on. It is your house, but it's of no value by itself.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So that's the nothing part.
Nice.
It's not because, it's not because I want to bow down to it. It's not because I want to look at it because it's pretty. It's that it's useful.
Right. Gotcha. Right on. Well, we are hitting our time box, and this
Okay.
has been a joy of a conversation. And I guess before we close it down, is there anything else you'd like to share or plug?
I've got no plug to share. I'm just doing doing what I'm doing, and actually working as a contractor now, and trying to lend experience to all the people I work with.
Nice.
And that's been kind of fun. And if any of the good stuff rubs off, I'm happy, and I try to keep the bad stuff to myself.
Right on. Well, good. Well, Artie, this conversation and all our previous conversations, whether asynchronously online or previous discussions, have always been a lot of fun for me and a lot of learning. So yeah, keep up the good work out there in the community. Much appreciated. And you did require some catering items.
I did.
Yeah. So sorry we could not fulfill those remotely.
I understand. I understand. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
No worries. No worries. So to our audience, please like and subscribe. Please share this episode to kind of spread the goodness of clarity on value of stories, scope and cognitive load, and how code is everything and yet it is nothing. And so yeah, please share this episode with others. We love to hear your feedback and thoughts on these things on LinkedIn, YouTube, X, and more. And so until next time, mob on everyone and have a good one. See ya.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.